The sun crept over Willow Creek like a bloodshot eye casting long shadows through the grimy back alley behind Dead Crow's Saloon. Callie Hayes knelt in the mud beside a man who looked like death itself had come calling. His once fine suit hung in tatters, dark stains spreading across the fabric that could have been mudblood or both. His breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps that made her stomach clench with worry. "Come on, mister," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. The man's face was pale as bone, his lips tinged blue from the cold morning air. "Open your eyes. If you don't wake up soon, the exposure or your injuries will finish you off right here where no one will find you." The alley stretched empty in both directions, nothing but silence and the stench of rotting garbage. Whoever had done this to him had left him to die like a dog in the dirt. But Callie Hayes had never been one to walk away from someone in need, even when she barely had 2 coins to rub together herself. At 22, Callie had learned to survive in Willow Creek through pure grit and stubborn determination. The mining boomtown attracted the worst kind of opportunists, men who saw unprotected women as easy prey to be ignored, harassed, or worse. She worked grinding overnight shifts at Dead Crow's Saloon, scrubbing tables until her knuckles bled for meager tips and whatever scraps of food she could salvage from abandoned plates. Her mother had died last winter, succumbing to a fever that racked her body for weeks, while Callie watched helplessly. The loss had devastated her, but what came after nearly broke her spirit entirely. Their small family farm had been foreclosed by the local banker, despite her mother's timely payments, documented in their careful records. Something stank about the whole affair. But Callie had no proof and no power to fight men with money and influence. Her father had died in a mining accident when she was 15, leaving behind only memories of a gentle man who had taught her to read and write by candlelight after long days in the silver mines. James Hayes had been well liked among the miners, known for his honesty and quiet strength. His death had been ruled accidental, but Callie sometimes wondered if there had been more to it than the official report suggested. Now she slept wherever she could find shelter, abandoned stables, empty alleys, sometimes the saloon's back room, if the owner felt generous. Every morning was a battle to scrape together enough for another day's survival. She had no family left, no friends with means to help, nothing but her own quick wits and the calloused hands that proved she'd never stopped fighting. The man stirred slightly, a low groan escaping his lips. Callie's pulse quickened with relief, but fear quickly followed. In the growing daylight, she could see his face more clearly now, and recognition hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any beaten stranger. This was Abraham Vaughn, the silver baron himself. He owned half the silver mines in Willow County and had a reputation for ruthless business dealings that left broken families in his wake. What the hell was Abraham Vaughn doing lying half dead in an alley behind the cheapest saloon in town? Pieces began falling into place as Callie remembered the previous night's commotion. There had been a high-stakes poker game in the saloon's back room, drawing wealthy gamblers from 3 counties over. Word was that someone had lost everything, in fact. Now, seeing Vaughn's expensive boots missing and his pockets turned inside out, she understood what had happened. The man who owned silver mines and controlled fortunes had been cleaned out at cards and then beaten and robbed by opportunistic thugs who left him for dead. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was the man whose kind had destroyed her life, lying helpless in the same dirt that had swallowed her family's dreams. She could walk away right now, let him die, and call it karma. Nobody would blame her. Nobody would even know. But looking at his gray face and hearing those desperate, shallow breaths, Callie knew she couldn't do it. Her mother had raised her to show basic human decency even to those who might not deserve it. Even to those who had never shown her any mercy in return. She hooked her arms under Vaughn's shoulders and started dragging him toward an abandoned stable 20 yards away. His dead weight made her muscles scream in protest, her slight frame straining against his solid bulk. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool morning air as she pulled him inch by agonizing inch across the muddy ground. You better not die on me after all this effort." She muttered, breathing hard, as she finally hauled him through the stable's broken door. "I've got enough guilt without adding your corpse to my conscience." The stable smelled of old hay and horse manure, but it offered shelter from the elements and prying eyes. Callie propped Vaughn against a wooden post and checked his pockets for anything that might help: coins for doctor papers with family contacts, anything useful. She found only a few scattered dollars, not nearly enough to buy professional medical help, but tucked away in his vest pocket was something that made her pause: a small, folded photograph of 3 people standing in front of a modest farmhouse. Her hands trembled as she recognized the figures in the faded image: her mother and father as young adults, flanked by a third man who looked remarkably like the beaten stranger she'd just rescued. On the back, in her father's distinctive handwriting, were the words, "James, Sarah, and Abraham, partners in the Lucky Strike, 1863. Before she could process what this meant, heavy footsteps thundered outside. Callie's blood turned to ice as 2 familiar voices approached the stable: Jimmy and Pike, the town's most notorious enforcers. They worked for Sheriff Morrison, collecting debts through intimidation and violence. But everyone knew they lined their own pockets with side jobs that skirted the law. The stable door crashed open, and the 2 thugs filled the doorway like harbingers of hell itself. Jimmy was tall and lean with mean eyes, while Pike was built like a bull with scarred knuckles that spoke of countless fights. Both men wore guns at their hips with the casual confidence of those who use them regularly. "Well, well." Jimmy drawled, his gaze fixing on the unconscious Vaughn. "Looks like someone beat us to the good stuff, but I bet old Abraham's still got something worth taking." Pike shoved Callie aside so hard she stumbled and nearly fell. "Out of the way, girl. This ain't your business." But Callie grabbed a pitchfork from the wall and stepped directly in front of Vaughn's prone form. Her hands trembled around the wooden handle, but her voice came out steady and clear. "He's got nothing left. You already took it all. Kill him and you'll hang for murder. Just take the coins and go." Jimmy laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Look at this brave little mouse, Pike. Thinks she can protect the big bad silver baron with a farming tool." When Jimmy lunged forward with casual arrogance, Callie surprised him by jabbing the pitchfork straight at his chest. The sharp tines caught his sleeve and scraped along his forearm, drawing blood and a string of vicious curses. Jimmy jerked back, more shocked than hurt, but Pike's hand dropped to his gun. "You just made a mistake, girl," Pike snarled. "We'll remember your face, and I'll remember yours." Callie shot back, keeping the pitchfork pointed at them. "Now get out before someone comes looking for all this noise." The 2 men exchanged glances, weighing their options. Neither wanted to explain a dead girl to the sheriff, especially when they were supposed to be on duty elsewhere. Jimmy wrapped his bleeding arm with his bandana and spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he warned. "We'll be back, and next time you won't have that pig sticker to hide behind." They stomped out of the stable, but Callie could hear them talking in low voices outside. Her nerves stretched taut as she realized they weren't leaving, just regrouping. She had bought time, nothing more. Behind her, Vaughn groaned and stirred, his eyelids fluttering. As his eyes opened and focused slowly on her face, his lips moved in barely audible whispers. James Hayes. I'm sorry, old friend." Callie knelt beside him, pitchfork still in hand, and watched confusion cloud his features as memory flooded back. "What did you say about my father?" Vaughn's hand went to his head, touching a swollen lump behind his ear. "The game. Christ, what happened?" His eyes found hers, studying her face with growing recognition. "You're James's daughter. You have his eyes. You knew my father," Callie demanded, pulling out the photograph she'd found in his pocket. "What's this about?" Vaughn's eyes widened as he saw the familiar image. Pain that had nothing to do with his physical injuries crossed his features. "Where did you find that?" "Your vest pocket." "Now tell me what it means. How did you know my parents?" As she dabbed at his wounds with water from a trough and strips torn from her skirt, Vaughn's story came out in painful fragments. Your father and I were partners once, before I struck it rich, and he stayed content with modest claims. We worked the Lucky Strike mine together for 3 years before I bought him out and expanded into bigger operations. Callie pressed the wet cloth against a gash on his forehead, ignoring his wince. That doesn't explain why you have their photograph. Because James made me promise. Vaughn said, his voice thick with regret. When he was dying from that cave-in, he made me swear I'd look after you and your mother if anything happened. I failed him, Callie. When the bank started threatening your farm, I was too much of a coward to help. The pieces were starting to form a picture that made Callie's stomach turn. You knew about the foreclosure. I knew more than that, Vaughn admitted. I'd been investigating suspicious land grabs because I was losing good miners whose families were being driven off their property. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. Same bank, same sheriff, same outcome every time. Footsteps circled the stable again, closer this time. Through gaps in the wooden walls, Callie could see Jimmy and Pike returning with reinforcements. Her stomach dropped as she counted at least 4 men now, all armed and looking for trouble. They're coming back, she whispered urgently. Can you move? Not far. Vaughn admitted, struggling to stand and immediately swaying on his feet. But Callie, I need to tell you where I hid the evidence I've been collecting. It's the only way to clear your parents' names and get back what was stolen from you. Later, she hissed, helping him stumble behind a pile of hay bales in the stable's far corner. Right now, we need to stay alive long enough for later to matter. They crouched in the shadows while the men searched outside with methodical thoroughness. Callie could hear them spreading out, checking every possible hiding spot. Her hands shook as she gripped the pitchfork, knowing it would be useless against 4 armed men. Check the stable again. Jimmy's voice carried clearly through the wooden walls. I saw blood on that girl's pitchfork. They're close. Minutes crawled by like hours as boots tramped around the building's perimeter. The sound of their breathing seemed impossibly loud in the confined space, and Callie was certain the men outside would hear them. Just when she thought they might give up, Pike's voice came from directly outside their hiding spot. Something's different in here. This hay's been moved. Vaughn's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezing gently. When she looked at him expecting fear, she saw instead a strange kind of resolve settling over his features. His fever had broken, and his eyes were clearer now, more focused. The evidence is in my saddle, he whispered so quietly she could barely hear him. Hidden compartment under the leather. If we can get to it. Where's the saddle? Back corner behind the feed sacks. I stashed it there before the poker game. They waited until the voices moved to the stable's front before creeping toward the rear corner. Behind a stack of moldy feed sacks, Callie found an expensive leather saddle that had clearly been hastily concealed. Her fingers traced the leather until she located a hidden panel that popped open under pressure. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with damning evidence written in multiple hands. Names, dates forged, signatures, property descriptions, everything needed to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of families like hers. As she flipped through the pages, she found her mother's name listed among the victims, along with details of the fraudulent foreclosure that had stolen their farm. But more shocking was what she found tucked into the back cover, the original photograph she'd discovered in Vaughn's pocket, along with a letter in her father's handwriting. Abraham, if anything happens to me, promise you'll watch over Sarah and Callie. They're all the family I have left. Your old partner, James Hayes. Below that in Vaughn's hand was a response that made her throat tighten. James, I swear on our friendship that I'll protect them. Your death won't be in vain. I'll find out what really happened in that mine. Abraham, you really did try to help. Callie whispered, understanding flooding through her. I failed your father twice. Vaughn said, pain evident in his voice. First, by not preventing his death, and then by being too afraid of Morrison and his men to honor my promise. If I'd been braver, your mother might still be alive. As Callie closed the ledger and tucked it securely in her bodice, footsteps approached from behind. She spun around to find Sheriff Morrison's deputy, a mean-faced man named Carter, who'd always looked at her with hungry eyes whenever she served drinks. Well, well. Carter drawled, his hand resting on his gun. Wondered where you'd gotten to, Callie girl. Jimmy said you'd found something interesting. Before she could react, Carter's fist caught her in the stomach, doubling her over with a gasp of pain. His second punch split her lip, sending her stumbling backward into the feed sacks. Blood filled her mouth, metallic and warm. What did you take from Vaughn's saddle? He demanded, grabbing her by the throat. Jimmy saw you rummaging around back here. From his position near the hay bales, the still weakened Vaughn watched Carter assault Callie with growing fury. Despite his injuries, he managed to grab a heavy horseshoe from the ground and hurl it with desperate accuracy. The iron shoe caught Carter in the knee with a sickening crack, sending the deputy sprawling with a scream of pain. Callie didn't waste the opportunity. She kicked Carter hard in the ribs, grabbed the pitchfork and ran back to Vaughn, while the deputy writhed on the ground, clutching his shattered kneecap. You stupid bastards. Carter wheezed, his face twisted with pain and rage. You have no idea what you've done. Sheriff Morrison will hunt you down like rabid dogs, and when he catches you, he'll make you beg for death. True to his word, Carter's screams had alerted the other men. Within minutes, the stable was surrounded by armed deputies and hired guns, all of them bought and paid for by the conspiracy Vaughn had uncovered. There would be no mercy, no chance to explain, no fair trial. They had become loose ends that needed to be permanently severed. Time to go, Vaughn said grimly, struggling to his feet with Callie's help. They'll burn us out if we stay. What followed was a nightmare of survival that tested every ounce of strength and cunning they possessed. Callie helped the staggering Vaughn through the stable's back wall, where loose boards allowed them to squeeze through into the narrow space between buildings. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharp shadows that provided minimal cover as they began their desperate flight. Their first destination was the maze of alleys behind Main Street, where Callie hoped her intimate knowledge of the town's layout might give them an advantage. But as they stumbled from shadow to shadow, bullets began whining past their heads. The mounted deputies had spread out to cover all the major routes, forcing them deeper into the labyrinth of back streets. This way. Callie panted, pulling Vaughn toward a narrow passage between two buildings. His weight dragged at her shoulder, and she could feel his strength ebbing with each step. Blood from his reopened wounds was soaking through his shirt, leaving a trail that their pursuers could easily follow. They pressed against the wall as hoofbeats thundered past the alley's mouth deputies, shouting coordinates to each other as they tightened their net. Vaughn's breathing was becoming labored, his face pale from blood loss. There's an old mine shaft about 2 miles north. He wheezed, leaning heavily against the brick wall. Abandoned for years, but it connects to some natural caves that come out near Willow Creek. If we can make it that far. Can you walk 2 miles? Callie asked, though she could see the answer in his weakening condition. I'll have to, Vaughn replied. It's our only chance. They moved from alley to alley, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers, but never gaining enough distance to rest. The sound of barking dogs reached them from the Main Street bloodhounds that would make their trail impossible to hide. The creek, Callie said, making a desperate decision. We need to get to the water to throw them off our scent. The next phase of their flight was the most harrowing yet. They slipped through the outskirts of town toward Willow Creek, which meandered through a dense stand of cottonwoods and willows before disappearing into the hills. Behind them, the baying of hounds grew closer, accompanied by shouted orders and the thunder of hooves. A bullet splintered bark from a tree inches from Callie's head, spurring her to greater speed despite Vaughn's dead weight. His condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she could feel him stumbling more frequently as blood loss sapped his remaining strength. The creek's just ahead. She panted, her own reserves running dangerously low. We can make it. They crashed through the undergrowth along the creek bank branches, tearing at their clothes and skin. The water was cold and fast-running, fed by mountain snowmelt that would numb them to the bone within minutes. But it was their only chance to escape the bloodhounds. Callie helped Vaughn wade into the current, supporting him as they moved downstream away from their pursuers. The icy water shocked him back to temporary alertness, but also began sapping what little strength he had remaining. Can't go much further. He gasped, his lips turning blue from cold and blood loss. Yes, you can. Callie insisted, though her own teeth were chattering uncontrollably. Tell me about my father. What was he like when you knew him? The question seemed to give Vaughn something to focus on beyond his pain. Stubborn as a mule, he said with a weak smile. Just like his daughter. He never gave up on a claim, even when everyone else said it was played out. They moved downstream for what felt like hours, the sound of pursuit gradually fading behind them. But Vaughn's condition continued to worsen, and Callie knew they needed shelter soon, or he would collapse entirely. There, she pointed to a thick grove of willows that overhung the water. We can hide there and tend to your wounds. The grove provided excellent concealment, its drooping branches creating a natural shelter. Callie pulled Vaughn onto a small sandbar and began working to stop his bleeding with strips of fabric torn from her already tattered dress. Your father saved my life once, Vaughn said as she worked, his voice growing weaker. Cave in at the Lucky Strike. I was trapped for 6 hours before he dug me out with his bare hands. Is that why you felt you owed him? Callie asked, trying to keep him conscious through conversation. Partly. But mostly it was because he was the only honest man I knew in this business. When he died, I lost more than a partner. I lost my conscience. In the distance, they could hear their pursuers regrouping. Radio crackle came through the trees as deputies coordinated their search pattern. Morrison's voice was clearly audible. They're on foot and wounded. Set up roadblocks on all routes out of the county. They can't have gone far. We need to move again, Callie whispered, helping Vaughn to his feet. Can you make it to that abandoned mine you mentioned? Vaughn nodded grimly, though his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. It's uphill from here through the forest. About a mile if we cut straight through. The trek through the dense woodland was a test of endurance that pushed both of them to their limits. Callie half-carried Vaughn up steep slopes covered in loose shale and fallen timber, her young muscles screaming in protest. Several times, exhaustion caused her to stumble, nearly sending them both tumbling down dangerous ravines. Wait, Vaughn gasped during one of their brief rests. Listen. Through the forest, sounds came, the distant noise of engines and voices. Their pursuers had brought vehicles to the area and were conducting a systematic grid search. Time was running out. The mine's just over that ridge, Vaughn said, pointing to a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile away. But we'll have to cross open ground to reach it. The final approach to the abandoned mine was the most dangerous part of their journey. The entrance was located on a bare hillside with no cover except for scattered boulders. As they prepared to make their run, the sound of approaching voices forced them to take cover behind the largest rock they could find. Check every mine shaft in this area. Morrison's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air. They're wounded and desperate. They'll go to ground somewhere. 3 deputies passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot, close enough for Callie to see the sweat on their faces and hear their labored breathing. She pressed herself against the stone, hardly daring to breathe, while Vaughn's blood continued to seep through his makeshift bandages. When the searchers finally moved on, Callie helped Vaughn make the final dash to the mine entrance. The opening was partially collapsed, but they managed to squeeze through into the darkness beyond. Inside, the shaft extended into the hillside for about 100 yards before branching into a network of smaller tunnels. This connects to the old Patterson workings, Vaughn explained as they caught their breath. There's an exit about 2 miles through the mountain, comes out near an abandoned homestead. But as they prepared to venture deeper into the mine, the sound of voices at the entrance made their blood run cold. Morrison and his men had found their trail. "Seal both ends," the sheriff ordered. "We'll smoke them out." The acrid smell of burning brush began drifting into the mine as Morrison's men lit fires at the entrance. Soon the tunnel would be filled with choking smoke, forcing them to choose between suffocation and surrender. "There's another way," Vaughn said desperately. "A ventilation shaft about halfway back. It's a tight squeeze, but it leads to the surface." They groped their way through the darkness, following the main tunnel, until they found the narrow shaft Vaughn had described. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, and it angled sharply upward toward a faint circle of daylight 40 feet above. "You first," Vaughn insisted, though Callie could see he was barely conscious from blood loss. "Not without you," she replied firmly. "We started this together, we finish it together." The climb through the ventilation shaft was a nightmare of claustrophobia and exhaustion. Callie pushed and pulled Vaughn up the narrow passage, her hands bleeding from the rough stone and her muscles cramping from the awkward position. Behind them, smoke began filling the mine as Morrison's fires took hold. They emerged gasping onto a rocky ledge high above the forest, the abandoned mine entrance visible far below, where smoke poured from the opening. But their relief was short-lived, and the ledge was part of a cliff face, with a 100-foot drop on one side and no apparent way down the other. "Look." Vaughn pointed weakly to a narrow game trail that zigzagged down the cliff face. "Animals use it to reach water. It's dangerous, but it's our only option." The descent was terrifying. The trail was barely 2 feet wide in places with loose rock that threatened to give way under their combined weight. Callie's fear of heights made her dizzy, but the sound of voices from the mine below drove her onward. Halfway down, disaster struck. Vaughn's weakness finally overcame him, and he stumbled, sending a shower of rocks cascading into the void. Callie lunged forward to catch him, but their combined weight proved too much for the crumbling ledge. For a heart-stopping moment, they teetered on the edge of the precipice. Callie's fingers clawing desperately at the rock face, while Vaughn's dead weight threatened to pull them both into the abyss. Only her grip on a stunted pine root kept them from falling to certain death. "Let me go," Vaughn whispered, his face deathly pale. "Save yourself." "Like hell," Callie snarled, using every ounce of her remaining strength to haul them both back onto solid ground. "My father didn't save your life, so you could throw it away now." They continued their precarious descent, each step a battle against exhaustion and terror. By the time they reached the bottom of the cliff, both were shaking from adrenaline and fatigue. But they had gained precious distance from their pursuers, who would need hours to find another route down from the mine. The abandoned homestead Vaughn had mentioned was little more than a few rotting timbers and a stone foundation, but it provided much-needed shelter. Callie used water from a nearby spring to clean Vaughn's wounds properly for the first time since their flight began, using strips torn from her petticoat to create better bandages. "Tell me more about my father," she said as she worked partly to keep him conscious and partly because she desperately wanted to know. "What happened to him in that mine?" Vaughn's eyes focused with effort. "It wasn't an accident, Callie. Someone had sabotaged the support timbers. James was getting too close to something, asking too many questions about who really owned the mineral rights to various claims. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Morrison killed him. I believe so, though I could never prove it. That's why I started investigating the land grab scheme. I owed it to James to find out the truth." As night fell, they could see torches moving through the forest below as Morrison's search parties continued their hunt. Radio chatter drifted up from the valley deputies reporting negative contacts and requesting additional manpower. "They won't give up," Vaughn said grimly. "Morrison knows that ledger contains enough evidence to hang him." "Then we need to get it to someone who can use it," Callie replied. "Tomorrow is Saturday. The whole town will be at the church meeting. If we can get there, that's miles from here, and they'll have roadblocks on every route." Callie studied the forest below, her mind racing. "Not every route. There's an old logging road that runs along the ridge. It's rough, but it connects to the cemetery behind the church. If we can reach it without being seen." They spent a cold, miserable night, huddled together for warmth, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to rest. Vaughn's condition remained stable but weak, and Callie knew he was running on determination alone. Dawn brought new challenges and new hopes. The search parties had pulled back to town during the night, apparently confident that their quarry couldn't escape the surrounding wilderness. But it also meant that they would be watching all the obvious routes to civilization. There, Callie pointed to a thin trail of smoke rising from the valley below. "That's the old Jameson place. Abandoned since the family died of influenza, but there might be supplies we can use." The trek to the homestead took most of the morning, with frequent stops to rest and rebandage Vaughn's wounds. The isolated farm had indeed been abandoned for years, but they found a few useful items: a rusty knife, some rope, and most importantly, 2 horses that had gone wild but were still wearing halters. "I haven't ridden in months," Vaughn admitted as they approached the wary animals. "But it beats walking." It took the better part of an hour to catch and calm the horses enough to mount them. The animals were thin and skittish, but they represented their best chance of covering the remaining distance to town before the church meeting ended. The ride through the back country was a race against time and their own physical limitations. Vaughn could barely stay upright in the saddle, swaying dangerously with each step his horse took. Callie rode beside him, ready to catch him if he fell, while constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. They reached the cemetery hill just as the church bells began ringing for the weekly town meeting. Through the trees, they could see the entire population of Willow Creek streaming toward the white-painted building where Sheriff Morrison would once again present himself as their protector and leader. "Now this is it," Callie said, helping Vaughn dismount behind a large mausoleum. "Once we go through those doors, there's no turning back." "Good," Vaughn replied, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "I'm tired of running from the truth." They approached the church from the cemetery side, using headstones for cover until they reached the building itself. Through the windows, they could see the congregation settling into pews, while Morrison called the meeting to order from the pulpit. "The irony," Vaughn observed grimly. "A criminal conducting town business from a house of God." Callie checked the ledger one final time, ensuring it was ready for presentation. "Remember, once I start reading, they'll try to stop us. You need to verify everything I say." They slipped in through the church's side door during the opening prayer when every head was bowed. The congregation was so focused on the sheriff's words that no one noticed 2 muddy, blood-stained fugitives taking positions near the altar. "Before we begin today's business," Morrison was saying, "I need to address the manhunt for 2 dangerous criminals who've been terrorizing our community. That would be us," Callie announced loudly, stepping into full view with the ledger held high. The congregation's reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some people screamed and dove for cover, while others reached for weapons they'd brought to defend against the dangerous criminals. But most simply stared in shock at the battered young woman who'd interrupted their sheriff. "Don't listen to her lies." Morrison snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "She's a thief and a murderer who... I'm the daughter of James and Sarah Hayes." Callie cut him off, her voice carrying clearly through the church. And this ledger contains proof that you murdered them both by orchestrating my father's mining accident and then stealing our farm." She opened the book and began reading in a clear, strong voice that penetrated every corner of the building. Property deed for the Hayes farm foreclosed on false debt of $300. Actual payments made $320 documented and witnessed by banker Thomas Whitman himself. Murmurs rippled through the assembled townspeople as they recognized the familiar pattern of their own losses. Morrison raised his gun, but Vaughn stepped forward despite his injuries. "I am Abraham Vaughn," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of his position. "I can verify every word in that ledger because I compiled the evidence myself. Sheriff Morrison, banker Whitman, and their associates have systematically murdered and robbed this community for over 5 years." The church erupted in angry shouts as people began to understand the scope of their betrayal. Morrison found himself facing not just 2 fugitives, but an entire congregation that was beginning to see through his lies. James Hayes didn't die in an accident. Vaughn continued, his voice growing stronger with righteous indignation. He was murdered because he discovered Morrison was falsifying mining claims and stealing mineral rights from legitimate prospectors. And the Henderson family, Callie added, turning to another page in the ledger, burned alive in their beds when they threatened to expose the land grab scheme. I have their lawyer's notes describing evidence of systematic forgery. Several men in the congregation stood up, their faces dark with fury. These were property owners who had struggled to understand their sudden financial ruin, now seeing the calculated nature of their destruction. 17 families dispossessed through manufactured debt. Callie continued reading. The Morrison Silver Company acquired mining rights to over 10,000 acres for a total payment of $17 through fraudulent foreclosures. The crowd's murmurs turned to roars of rage as the full scope of the crimes became clear. Friends and neighbors who had died under mysterious circumstances were revealed as murder victims. Property that had been lost to legitimate foreclosure was exposed as outright theft. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he raised his gun with desperate resolve. Enough. These are lies from desperate criminals trying to save their own necks. But banker Whitman, who had been sitting in the front pew, suddenly stood and backed away from Morrison. "I never agreed to murder," he said loudly. "The land deals, yes, but not killing families." "Shut up, you fool," Morrison snarled, swinging his gun toward his partner. The shot that followed echoed through the church like thunder, but it wasn't Morrison's gun that fired. Deputy Marshal Jake Collins, who had ridden in from the territorial capital to investigate reports of corruption, lowered his smoking pistol as Morrison collapsed with a bullet in his shoulder. "Abraham Vaughn sent word to my office 3 days ago," Collins announced to the stunned congregation. "We've been investigating this corruption ring across multiple counties. The evidence these 2 brought us today confirms everything." In the aftermath, the full scope of the conspiracy unraveled with stunning speed. Banker Whitman, faced with murder charges, confessed to his role in the land grab scheme. Other conspirators, including several deputies and the judge who had rubber-stamped the false foreclosures, were arrested within hours. The ledger's detailed records enabled rapid legal action that restored property to rightful owners with full compensation for years of illegal seizure. Callie not only reclaimed her mother's farm, but received substantial damages for the fraudulent foreclosure that had cost her family everything. More importantly for Callie's peace of mind, the truth about both her parents' deaths was publicly revealed and acknowledged. Her father was posthumously vindicated as a victim of murder, not industrial accident, while her mother was cleared of any suggestion of financial irresponsibility. Abraham Vaughn spent 3 weeks recovering from his injuries under doctor's care. But his first act upon regaining his strength was to visit the cemetery with Callie. They stood together before 2 simple headstones, looking down at the graves that would soon bear new inscriptions honoring James and Sarah Hayes as victims of criminal conspiracy. "I kept my promise to your father," Vaughn said quietly, placing fresh flowers on both graves. "It took me longer than it should have, but we finally got them." "You saved our family's honor," Callie replied, her voice thick with emotion. "My father would have been proud of what you accomplished." Vaughn looked at her with deep respect and something that might have been paternal affection. "What will you do now? The mine partnership your father and I shared, his half belongs to you by right. Combined with the farm and the compensation, you'll never want for anything again." Callie smiled, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't known since her parents' deaths. "I think I'll rebuild what Morrison destroyed. This community needs honest leadership to heal from what he did to us." As summer progressed into autumn, the changes in Willow Creek were dramatic and far-reaching. The corrupt officials were tried and sentenced, with Morrison receiving life in prison for multiple murders and Whitman getting 20 years for conspiracy and fraud. Their various accomplices faced sentences proportional to their involvement. Callie established herself as a respected landowner and community leader, using her experience of hardship to help other families rebuild their lives. The combined properties she'd inherited became a foundation for honest development, providing jobs and opportunity for those who had lost everything to the conspiracy. Most importantly, the truth about the systematic theft and murder had been revealed and acknowledged by the entire community. A memorial in the town square now honored all the victims of Morrison's crimes, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten and serving as a warning against future corruption. Abraham Vaughn had become not just an ally, but the closest thing to family Callie had left. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond built on mutual respect and the knowledge that they had both found redemption through helping each other honor the memory of James Hayes. On a crisp October evening, Callie sat on the porch of her rebuilt family home, watching the sun set over land that truly belonged to her again. The ledger that had saved both their lives rested in a place of honor on her mantelpiece, alongside the photograph of her parents and their old partner. A reminder of how courage and loyalty could triumph over even the most entrenched corruption. The scars of their desperate flight would always remain, but they had been transformed from marks of victimization into badges of survival and justice. Callie no longer saw herself as a penniless saloon girl who had stumbled onto something greater than herself. She had become exactly what both her parents had hoped she would be: a strong woman who made her own destiny while honoring the sacrifices of those who came before. As the stars appeared overhead, Callie smiled and headed inside to plan the next day's work. There was still much to be done in rebuilding Willow Creek, but for the first time since her parents' deaths, she looked forward to the challenge. The secret gift that had saved her life. Vaughn's hidden evidence, combined with her own courage to use it, had given her something far more valuable than property or wealth. It had given her the chance to honor her family's memory while building a future worthy of their sacrifice. The story of their survival had become legend in Willow Creek, but for Callie Hayes, it was simply the foundation of a life built on truth, courage, and the unshakable belief that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. The nightmare was over. The real work of living and remembering could finally begin.